Good to start with what I think of as the fundamental promise of IFR flying, is this idea of going where you want, when you want. If you remove either of these restrictions, you can do it all VFR. If you wait long enough for perfect weather, you can fly around the world in a weight shift microlight VFR, and plenty of people have done it. Equally, if you're not worried about where you go and the weather's good over there in the west, then let's go over to the west, VFR today. So it's all about the weather. But we, as private pilots, raise the bar a little higher. And we attempt to do all of this, which is in many ways the promise of commercial air transport, or perhaps of net jets, with less capable aircraft, single crew, less training, less systems, passengers who are certainly up for a little bit of adventure, but not too much. And those same passengers want to get home on time. And for many of us, there's a lot of satisfaction that comes for the very reason that this is tough. This idea, the sense of satisfaction of having played a fair and decent game of three-dimensional chess with the weather and got everybody home smoothly, safely, on time. And dealing with the weather is a major part of meeting that challenge. And we only have to look at the accident stats to realize we have to take this seriously. So we set ourselves a tricky problem of planning and decision making, and these weather seminars were set up specifically to do whatever we can to help with that problem of planning and decision making. Two important principles that have been in place right from the very start. First, we are private pilots. We're free to make our own choices about what type of weather conditions we fly in. And we're all going to make different choices. The variables might be different mission, different aircraft, or your personal choices on the day, how we're feeling, or who the passengers are. Up until quite recently, I've been flying my dear old mum. She's now 92. And I pick different weather for that than if I were flying with one of you, with my aircraft co-owner. And I think being able to say, I just don't feel like flying today or in these conditions is actually a great privilege for private pilot, and we shouldn't forget that. Secondly, and really importantly, this seminar is not and never has been about advocating flying in any more or less extreme weather. That is your decision, Captain. Why me, by the way? Like most of us, but not all of us on this call, I am purely a private pilot. I did my instrument rating very early on in my flying training in 1993. And I had the great privilege of being able to fly myself around on business and my friends and family. But I had to be absolutely sure of getting there. And just to be clear, this was pre-internet really, and certainly pre-low-cost airlines. So I had to be clear about whether I was going to get there 2 or 3 days in advance. And weather forecasting was pretty primitive in those days. So as a result, I've developed what is perhaps a slightly unhealthy interest in weather, much to the amusement and frustration of my friends and family. But that's really why I'm here. I also share my aircraft with one of the founders of AvBrief. And the very beginning of these seminars was done with a gentleman, Anthony Bowles, one of our previous chairmen, who has an even deeper interest in weather than I do. He has his own weather station up on his house in Scotland. But for the avoidance of all doubt, I'm not a professional or a qualified meteorologist. I do hope I've got something useful to share with you this evening. So, our agenda. These seminars are in 3 slices. I'm going to do a short chunk on a general weather topic, then on a specific weather topic, and then wrap up where I hand over control of this meeting from me to you and set a scenario to really consolidate some of the thinking we'll be developing during the course of the next hour. The session today is, the general topic is about structuring the weather planning process. The specific topic is airframe icing, and the practical scenario is, can I get home tomorrow? And to come, should this be successful today and we continue with this series of seminars, some of the general topics are around numerical weather prediction and all the different weather planning resources that are available online. In terms of the specific topic, I have the remainder of the 4, that's thunderstorms, fog, wind, and the +1, which is the layers and tops, and all manner of different scenarios to connect in with that bit of those specific weather topics. So our general topic this evening is about structuring the weather planning process. As I said in the intro, we've set ourselves a pretty tough challenge, and consequently we've got a complex decision to make. What I've found over the years of doing these seminars is that a little bit of structure really helps. So part 1 of this seminar is me sharing my thoughts on and approach and giving a bit of structure to planning and decision making for weather. My intention is to encourage your own thinking rather than being prescriptive and saying, well, this is how it's got to be done. So as a high-level model, and as with many high-level models, I think of it all in 3 steps. Step 1 is really build a mental model of forecast weather. What you are going to need to do to achieve that will be specific to you, because we all see the world and all conceptualize models in different ways. But having a model is the absolute foundation. Number 2, develop a strategy for the flight, and I'll cover a process for doing that. And then number 3, get on and make a decision. File, reschedule, or abandon. And what I'll do using a live worked example is share with you my process for doing this. Starting point. Every flight I do, every flight I've planned in the last few years has started with a vertical cut using Grammet from Autorouter. For me, it's my absolute number 1 starting point, because I think it's amazing just how quickly you can get a snapshot for what's going on from one click on your screen. This particular example is a 500 nautical mile flight from Cambridge to Copenhagen. And we can very, very rapidly see that the weather for the second half of the flight over here is probably frontal. Using the 4+1 model, we can see that there is some ice forecast, and that the freezing level is reasonably low, but probably above the MSA. There is almost certainly no thunderstorms, but we can see there's some low cloud down here, but probably not enough to affect IFR minima, but that's something we should check. And in terms of wind, we have a very strong wind, a strong tailwind of 55, 65 knots right on the tail at altitude, which is nice to have, but also some severe low-level turbulence over the continent. And they were the 4, the ice, thunderstorms, visibility, and wind. And the +1 says, well, there might just be a layer here. Might just be a layer at flight level 120 and -10, -12 degrees. I personally would not want to bet on it being there. And I would be much, much happier with the idea of flight level 220 and -30 degrees, if only I had a turbocharged aircraft, which I don't. So, but isn't it amazing just how much you can get from one image? But I don't think you should ever take just one single view of forecast weather to make a decision. And I like the principle of taking various cuts and also zooming in and zooming out. So first step, vertical cut. I would then immediately go to a horizontal cut that allows me to look at the weather either side of track, get a quick check on the timing of the weather, what directions it's moving in and what speed. By the way, this chart is from a completely different day. It's actually surprisingly representative of the weather that's on that applies to the Cambridge to Copenhagen flight. The rest of the data is from that same flight. I then like to zoom out and use synoptics to be able to answer the question, why is the weather being forecast to be as it is? And we can see here that indeed there is a front involved, and there are some close isobars which correlates with the strong wind that we were seeing. We can also see that our route takes us almost along the front, which is not great really. And then finally, we then zoom in and get some detail. And from the detail, we can see, yes, indeed, there's some strongish surface wind, but it is right down the runway. And there is indeed also some low cloud, but a long way from being a concern for IFR minima. And it's also worth bearing in mind that although the zooming in can usually only be done the day before, it is the first time where you're getting a cross-check from an aviation forecaster. But I hope you can see that in just, I think we've used about 3 or 4 minutes to talk this through, we can really build a whole mental model of the weather forecast to be happening on this particular day for this particular flight. Having got a mental model, it's now time to develop a strategy for the flight and make a decision. Here's the way I go about it. Step 1 is assess the hazards. That's the 4: ice, thunderstorms, fog, and wind. Step 2, look at the mitigations. What might I be able to do in terms of different routings or levels or timing, or to use knowledge about layers and tops to change, to change levels. Step 3, escape routes. Why might I need some escape routes? Well, the absolute #1 reason why a pilot might need an escape route is the weather does not equal the forecast. And because there is some uncertainty involved with every forecast, that is always the case to some degree or another. But there could be aircraft issues or passenger issues that we need to deal with. And we need to understand in advance what the escape routes look and feel like. And then finally, what about the limitations we want to apply to this flight? The pilot, currency, how much mental headspace, how am I feeling on this particular day? The aircraft, how reliable, how current is the aircraft? Is it just out of annual? Has it not been used for some time? And then finally, what are the transportation requirements? Is this something where we absolutely need to be there that day? Or is this just a, well, we'll go flying and give it a try? And by running through those links, I then get myself to the point where I decide, file, persevere, which I hate doing, which is let's delay the decision. Let's have another look tomorrow. Reschedule or abandon. So reviewing this particular flight to Copenhagen, I saw that my options were, well, maybe to file for flight level 110, just a bit higher than this magenta line, and have a look at what the layers and density of cloud looks like. I could perhaps plan a route with a step. It's always easier and simpler to cross the Amsterdam TMA at flight level 100. But I know that once one is at the Dutch border here at Groningen, it's okay to fly across Germany IFR at 5,000 feet. That in many ways is trading a risk of ice up here at flight level 110 with a certainty of being bounced around in cloud at 5,000 feet. But at least then I'll be able to do that one. could change the routing horizontally, go further out into the North Sea, and then cross the front at right angles. To be honest, even in a twin, I don't feel that good about deliberately heading out across the North Sea more than I have to in January. And then 4 is to change the time domain. This is a fast-moving front. We can see that from the horizontal cuts. Although it will be dark in Copenhagen on arrival, it might be a flight where it's good to delay by 3 hours and go a little bit later. To be honest, this is a tricky one to plan for. I'd imagine that the computer models and the Met Office would have difficulty planning the exact timing and speed of that front. And the circumstances for me personally was I absolutely must be in Copenhagen that day for an unmissable business meeting the day after. I personally find that I have to do all this sort of thinking at least the day before, if not a couple of days before. I'm just not able to process all of this on the morning of the flight, particularly if I've got to think about booking some commercial air transport tickets as part of the outcome. And I would have probably set myself a cut-off time where if I've not made a firm decision by now, abandon the flight. I probably would have thought about getting up to the Dutch border and climbing as I got closer to the front, maybe heading a little bit further out into the North Sea and trying it out at flight level 150, nearly minus 20 degrees C, and just seeing what it was like, knowing that I had the escape route, going back to the earlier point, of a rapid descent to below the freezing level across Germany. You will have gathered from some of my choice of words I've used in the last 2 minutes that I didn't fly this route. It was actually for a slightly different reason than you might imagine. I actually abandoned the idea of flying my Comanche across to Copenhagen about a week before the actual date of the flight, but thought it was a great exercise to go through the weather planning in case I ran another weather seminar. I think it's a useful exercise. You remember that part about aircraft reliability? I felt my aircraft was talking to me. Something wasn't right with one of the engines, and I just thought this wasn't the right flight to be doing. It was the last flight before annual, and I decided this just doesn't make sense. I abandoned the flight, went on Ryanair, and put the aircraft in for annual. And as you will have seen on the forum, the engine was found to be full of metal. It probably would have got me there, but to be honest, I'm glad I didn't try. So there you go. There's my thoughts about structuring a process for making some weather decisions, building a mental model, developing a strategy, making a decision. I'm going to stop sharing, and I would like to open us up for, we've got 10 minutes. We can ask some questions. Who would like to open the questioning? We have 48 people. My goodness. Hello, everybody.
Hi, it's Aiden here.
Hi, Aiden.
Do you mind if I ask you, as a great start for 10, a quick question about that Grammet that you looked at. To go up high, to minus 20, I think you said it was, to go high, it looked like there was cloud. Is there not a certainty of icing up there, even though the Grammet only showed icing in a patch? And even when you go down to 5,000 feet, you would have been bobbling along around the zero isotherm. Is that not something we should be afraid of?
I'll share my answer, and I'd be delighted if others chip in.
Alan, before you share, could you re-share the Grammet so we can have it in front of us as you describe it?
Indeed. Everybody see that?
Perfect.
So, Aiden, your question was, why did I think flight level 150? I will be explaining this in more detail in the next piece, in fact, on icing. But the short answer is the the scale of the icing threat colder than -15 does go down. And I'll be explaining the science and the physics behind that in the next section. It is a risk. It's a particular risk to do that in my aircraft because it's not turbocharged, and therefore the amount of performance that it has at flight level 150 is quite limited. It is de-iced, so it has alcohol props and de-icing boots. And I think maybe most importantly, this is a strategy I've used in the past. But it is, to be absolutely clear, and it's a good question to ask, this is a strategy with some risk. And I am willing to at least postulate this strategy publicly. I didn't fly it because of the escape route. Part of that,
having de-ice on your aircraft probably changes your threshold for risk too. So I get that.
The second question that you raised is, well, aren't we going to be bobbling around at the 0 isotherm? My personal experience is if it's plus 0.1 of a degree out there, I don't pick up any ice. So the second thing is, even though my aircraft is not very fast, it does get a little bit of what we call ram rise. And ram rise is probably the equivalent of about 1,000 feet on the freezing level. Now, this could be simply a manifestation of errors in the calibration of my outside air temperature probes on the aircraft that I've flown, but I have found it consistent that get to 0 degrees, no ice.
Can I just say something there? I would assume that a lot of people, unless you've got oxygen on board, you'll be limited to flight level 100 anyway for the cruise.
Indeed.
So you're sort of limiting yourself. I've flown before and actually asked air traffic control if they can ask around to see if we can get positioning between layers for flights before, because I've been limited to flight level 100 myself.
Well, I think I don't know what you fly, but certainly I've always thought that one of the best bargains in terms of aircraft performance enhancement is a portable oxygen system, because a lot of Europe has a minimum of flight level 90 or 80, and if we're limiting ourselves to flight level 100 without oxygen, which I think is a very sensible thing to do, then we've really only got 2 levels, which is, or 2,000 feet. We've got 80, 90, and 100. Buy some oxygen, and you've then trebled the number of levels that you've got.
I think one of my last flights across the channel was flying an air ambulance, Chieftain, and that was around about the time when that aircraft went down coming from France with a footballer on board. I climbed as high as flight level 100, but I was still picking ice up. So I then asked for descent, and by the time I'd got to Jersey, I think I was down about 2,000 feet, down to 2,000 feet. And air traffic is very, very helpful when you start talking about ice. They tend to clear the way for you.
Yep.
Alan, can I ask what your source is for the grommet and whether certain grommets are better than other grommets?
As far as I'm aware, there are 2 sources of grommet. There is OGMET, OGIMET, and there is AutoRouter. When I do my piece on numerical weather prediction, I'll give you the pros and cons of various weather models. But a very simple answer is they're using the same data. They're not, but the first level answer is they're using the same data. AutoRouter, in my view, just does a much better job of depicting that data. OGMET has a very clunky interface, and I don't think it does anywhere near as good a job of depicting the data. And as I talked you through earlier on with this particular cross-section, you get one click and you've got this, and there's just so much information about the weather available.
Alan, if you don't mind, so looking at this GRAMET, how much consideration would you take into account if you chose to fly at flight level 150 as to picking up ice during the descent and possibly being stuck somewhere at a hold right in the middle of that sort of icing layer there?
Excellent question. Were I up at flight level 150, I would be looking to negotiate a descent all the way down to 5,000 feet as a single clearance. And for me personally, because I'm based in Cambridge, a lot of my flying, like many of us on this call, is straight into the London TMA. And sometimes it is very difficult to get a word in edgeways. Were this the London TMA, I would personally probably choose not to do this in this particular way. However, this is Copenhagen, and that's a different place. But I would definitely want a single clearance from flight level 150 down to 5,000 feet. One thing, and I would touch on this in a moment, some forecasts are all over the place in terms of accuracy. The one forecast I find repeatedly to be really quite accurate is the freezing level. Unless there's something really complicated going on, such as inversion layers and sub-zero layers and that sort of thing. But in general, I find the freezing level forecast extremely accurate.
Alan, Robert DeRoy here. Question for you. You made the point earlier about temperatures colder than -15, less susceptible to accruing ice. I understand that. Following on from a question earlier, you made a point about escape plans and a rapid descent into warmer, moister air. Even if you did it quickly, you know, there's a risk there that you will take on an awful lot of ice very quickly with an airframe that's still at -20 when you go down.
Indeed. I think that's part of the consideration. And again, it's certainly something I wouldn't want to do without a de-iced aircraft. Time for one more. But let me just check in with everybody. Is this working for everybody?
Yeah, it's great.
Absolutely.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do, and maybe it's a pertinent time to do so, is to move on to the second part of this seminar, which is about the theory and the forecasting of a particular type of weather. So let's move us on. Just as a question for everybody, I have some odd stripes, almost like scratches on my screen. Are you seeing it as well?
Yeah, we can see the two vertical lines on the left-hand end,
Yeah.
vertical line bottom right and horizontal line top right.
Yeah. Does anybody who's a very experienced Zoom user, is this something that you've seen before?
I think it's
you've drawn. Oh, I'm sorry, Paul.
Somebody's used their annotate function.
You've drawn on a picture at some stage and you haven't cleared. So if you go back into annotation and press the dustbin, it'll go away.
Thank you very much. There we go.
That's it.
Brilliant, Timothy. Thank you very much indeed.
And Paul got there as well.
So, icing. Of the four weather parameters, the thunderstorms, the fog, the wind, ice is the one I think has got the most mystery around it, and that's why I chose to do this one first. There's a bit of a nasty combination where the forecasting is really surrounded in some degree of mystery. There's always caveats and exceptions. And then we hear plenty of horror stories about what happens if you encounter too much ice in an aircraft. There are thousands of pages of online resources about airframe icing. And what I've done is chosen a tiny bit of content that we can deliver in 20, 25 minutes that I hope perhaps provides just a little bit deeper understanding and a useful basis for making a safe flight given all this uncertainty, and provide you with some hints and tips for deepening your knowledge away from this seminar. Now, there are all manner of legal and certification issues around icing, and I have chosen not to include them as part of this seminar. I know that if I did, it might take up very much of our time. I see my job this evening as being to do what I can to try and demystify the phenomenon and be straight about the limits of forecasting. But let there be no doubt that ice demands our utmost respect. What I'm going to do is a refresher on the aerodynamics and basic physics of icing, then cover the definitions and forecasting, and finish up with a one-page what you need to know. So, a reminder of the aerodynamic forces. Airframe icing is bad news on all four forces of flight. It's primarily aerodynamic, and it hurts our flying because it messes up the aerodynamics of our flying surfaces and our propellers. What happens is, in order to maintain level flight, airspeed or rate of climb if you're climbing has to go down because we've messed up our airfoils, and stall speed increases. Stall speed can actually increase really quite dramatically, and it doesn't take too much to figure out what happens in the end game of this particular pincer movement. All of this hurts a slippery, efficient aircraft much more acutely than a draggy one. De-icing systems restore a good proportion of performance, but not all. And TKS restores a high proportion of lost performance, and therefore I think is an excellent choice for a slippery aeroplane like a Cirrus. But be no doubt, the natural conclusion is with enough aircraft on an aircraft, you will no longer be able to climb, no longer be able to sustain level flight, and you can also have your aerodynamics sufficiently affected to cause catastrophic loss of control. As I said, icing deserves our utmost respect. So what I'd like to do is move on to the basic physics as a bit of a refresher of the physics of airframe icing. And I would like to start with a light-hearted poll to you all. So let's launch the poll. Here's a slightly badly worded question, the sort that you might be familiar with from your theoretical knowledge exams, that says, well, how many parameters are you looking to determine whether airframe icing will happen? You're looking for one thing, 2, 3, or 4. As I said, this is a deliberately quite vaguely worded question. Go ahead, you've got 30 seconds. Oh, by the way, all polls on this particular event this evening are anonymous. Okay, well, we are at 90% response rate, which is pretty good for a poll. I will end the poll and I will share the results with you. Everybody see that? So a predominant view in this meeting that 3 parameters, closely followed by 2. Only a couple of people thought that 1 was perhaps the best answer to this slightly vague question. What I'd like to do is share a video with you, and at the end of that, I'll share with you my own view to the answer to this particular question. Now, I know Zoom isn't the best platform for sharing videos, but we'll do the best we can. And it's only a 3-minute video. It's by a guy called calls himself on YouTube Veritasium. He is a high school science teacher who became a full-time YouTuber 10 years ago, and this is one of his early videos. I think it's really useful. It's 3 minutes long, and it gives us a great foundation into understanding airframe icing. So let me share the screen and with some sound, and please forgive the slight jerkiness of the video, but let's see how it goes. So here we go.
So you want to see water freeze almost immediately? Well, here's what you're going to need. Some very pure water. Fiji water has been recommended to me by a friend. And obviously we're going to need a freezer, some way to cool it down. So I'm going to put this bottle of water in the freezer in the area normally occupied by the ice cube trays, because I think that might be the coldest part of my freezer. I've got 2 bottles just in case one doesn't work. And now we have to wait. There are lots and lots of videos showing this phenomenon on YouTube, but very few that explain how it actually works. So I'd like to take a minute and do that. Water is normally a liquid at room temperature because the water molecules are all flowing past each other, tumbling around each other, and that allows the substance to flow. When something becomes solid, its molecules all more or less lock into place. They still vibrate, but they're not rolling over each other and moving past each other so they can no longer flow. They're solid. Now what we're doing here is supercooling the water. So we're taking it below its temperature, below 0 degrees, where it should become ice. But it's very difficult for that water to make the transition without somewhere for that ice crystal to start growing. So what we need is some kind of nucleation event. If the water is not pure, the impurities in the water naturally act as sites where the crystal can start forming. That's why it's very important that we use very, very pure water. Another way we can cause this nucleation event is to bang the water bottle. Hopefully that'll cause a few water molecules to line up in the right way, and that will seed the rest of the ice crystal. So let's give it a few hours and we'll come back and try to nucleate this, this ice forming event. Alright, it's taken a few days and multiple attempts, but I think this could finally be it. I might have finally created supercooled water. So let's find out. I'm going to take the water very carefully out of the freezer. And now you can see clearly that the water is still liquid. You can see this air bubble floating around. And now I'm going to bang it on the counter and we will see if we can get an ice crystal to form. Whoa, look at that! You can see that ice crystal growing right down from the top to the bottom. So there you have it. I was finally able to demonstrate the supercooled water phenomenon. I cooled down the very pure water in my freezer for 2 or 3 hours, and then by banging the water bottle on the counter, I started the formation of an ice crystal at the top of the bottle of water, which quickly grew down to the bottom. Now, performing this experiment was a lot more difficult than I anticipated. I did this at least 8 times with about 5 different bottles of water. Whoa. And I only managed to catch it on tape once. So it was a real challenge. Things I learned were that you can't leave the water in the freezer too long, otherwise it will freeze up on its own accord. And also you have to be very careful when pulling the water out of the freezer that you don't bump it, because otherwise it will start freezing right away before you have a chance to bang it on the counter. So give it a try and see if you can make it work.
Did that work okay for everybody? Excellent, thank you. So if we debrief that video, what we can learn is that supercooled water droplets exist as a liquid and then instantly freeze on impact. And we need that instant freezing on impact to get airframe icing. Ice crystals won't stick to an airframe, and neither will snow. But the instant freezing from the impact of the supercooled water droplet being nucleated by hitting your airframe at 160 knots is what causes airframe icing to happen. The other thing, the second thing out of that video that is quite useful is a sense that supercooled water droplets are a little bit fragile and rare, and they don't really want to be liquid. It doesn't take much before they become solid. So they will eventually, or given half a chance, will flip into a solid. So we've got this sort of delicate little thing sitting around in clouds until we come along and hit it with the leading edge of our wing or our propellers. There is actually a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on with this experiment, but the fundamental truth of needing supercooled water droplets remains the case. And by the way, that rather badly worded question I shared with you all in the poll, I think the reality is you can answer the question with any one of those answers will be correct. You can argue the case. 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 probably and more. My personal choice of the answer is you are looking for one thing. You are only looking for the parameter of the supercooled water droplet. And that's why I shared the video. But there are all sorts of other reasons why you can make the case for 2, 3, 4, and 5 and so on being the correct answers. So what I'll do is share a couple of short videos showing ice building up in an icing wind tunnel. The first one is extremely realistic but not very exciting. And the second one is a bit more exciting. Let's go back to my screen share. So here's the first one. This is rime ice building up. That's probably about 1 or 2 centimeters. It's a time-lapse video of light rime ice building up in the NASA wind tunnel. I think that's a very good sense of what it actually feels like in rapidly speeded up of seeing some light rime icing building up on your aircraft's wing. NASA, being NASA, also have done some studies around extreme severe ice. And this is the extreme severe ice video. And I think what we can learn from that is once ice starts to build up, there's no stopping it. There's not a sense of, oh, it gets to a centimeter or whatever. If you keep throwing supercooled water droplets at ice buildup, it just keeps coming. So our challenge, therefore, is to tackle the question. And I was asked a question about the -15, -20 degrees earlier on. We want to tackle the question about where we seek this one phenomenon, this supercooled water droplet. And I really like this diagram from the COMET program. It's part of the University of Colorado. And it takes a cloud and slices it into 4 slices. What I quite like about it is that it is unambiguous. Warmer and lower than 0 degrees, no icing threat, liquid water. Above -40, or colder than -40, higher than -40, no icing threat because there are only ice crystals in the cloud. The significant icing threat is here between 0 and -15. That's where the cloud is predominantly liquid, supercooled liquid, and that's where we find most of the icing. And as we go higher in the cloud, we get to what is called mixed phase cloud, where there's a mixture of ice crystals and supercooled water droplets. what's happening is the supercooled water droplets end up bumping into an ice crystal and turning into an ice crystal themselves. So there is a reduced threat of icing between -15 and -40. However, it would be wrong to deduce that the icing is somehow lighter in this -15 to -40. All the literature, and certainly my personal experience, says it's much more about horizontal variability. You can fly along in a cloud at that sort of temperature, no ice, and then all of a sudden hit some reasonably significant icing, and then all of a sudden there's no ice again. And the reason behind this phenomenon, I believe, is due to updrafts in the cloud. You fly along in an updraft, you pick up a bit more ice if you're flying in this particular part of the cloud. To try and bring it to life, here's a photograph out the window of a light aircraft at flight level 120 and -18 Celsius. And I'm not a meteorologist, but I get a pretty good sense that down here we have some bubbly looking cloud that will be full of supercooled water droplets. And if you were to fly through there at -5, -7 degrees, you'd pick up a lot of ice. Here, you can start to see the bubbliness of the cloud fading away. And there is mixed phase cloud. And then finally, there's a good example of what's called glaciated cloud, where the cloud has turned into ice crystals and you're unlikely to have any icing threat. To be clear, this is my aeroplane, by the way, I was flying. I didn't go in and have a look. I think the general strategy for avoiding icing with cumuliform cloud is you avoid it laterally. You figure out a way around the clouds. For stratiform cloud, that's when you can start to look for making a small change in level up or down to try and get out of ice. To be clear, the more lifting there is, because a lot of these droplets rely on updrafts, the more ice you're going to get. So the bigger the cumulus, the more active the front, nice bit of terrain, all of that will greatly increase the levels of icing. Likewise, if you get cloud tops that don't go high enough to get cold enough to turn into glaciated ice clouds, there's also a concentration of supercooled water droplets in the tops of cumulus and stratocumulus clouds. And as I said earlier, cumuliform avoid laterally, stratiform avoid vertically. So to move on to some of the definitions and the forecasting of ice, these are the FAA definitions: light, moderate, severe, and they define it in terms of centimeters per hour of accretion. And the FAA go on to come up with some plain language descriptions of what happens. Light icing, occasional use of de-icing equipment. Moderate, short encounters become potentially hazardous. Severe, you can read. And they also post some interesting pictures that they use to illustrate light, moderate, severe icing. And roughly speaking, light icing is about smaller droplets, lower liquid water content, and rime ice. Severe icing tends to be larger droplets, higher liquid water content, and clear ice. So as you know, those of us flying aircraft with limited performance, piston GA, for a valuable icing forecast for the lighter end of GA, we just need an accurate way of predicting liquid water content and droplet size in clouds. That's all we need. Problem: no one has figured out how to do this yet. And there are all manner of learned papers that are exploring the issue. But in terms of really predicting exact amount of droplets and exact amount of liquid water content and droplet size, nobody's quite worked out how to do this. Oh, and by the way, therefore, as pilots, we have to learn to live with this. That is unlikely to go away in the next few years. In my experience, forecast accuracy is at its most variable as to whether ice is there or light or moderate, and whether that exists, or when it does exist, whether it's light or moderate. I find that when somebody writes the phrase severe ice in a forecast, it is usually for jolly good reason and needs to be taken seriously. There's the grammet I showed earlier. It's a great way of getting a snapshot on ice. There are a few limitations of this of which you should be aware, particularly if your aircraft is not equipped for flying in icing conditions. This model uses Met model parameters to create an index. If the index number that is spat out by the computer model is between 30 and 80, the chart is colored in pale green, and that's called moderate icing risk. What we need to understand is that 1 pixel away from that light green area, the icing index is almost certainly 29, which is the top end of light icing, which might be rather quite a lot of icing for a number of different aircraft types. So don't assume, oh yeah, just here, there's going to be no ice because it's not green. There will be light ice. The other thing with this model is that it doesn't always show icing in cumuliform cloud, and I can go into the technicalities offline from this seminar, but be aware that if you were to fly through this cumulus here at -5 degrees, I think you could pretty much guarantee you would pick up some ice. Another model is, this is a paid-for subscription model from Deutsche Wetterdienst called Advice. And this shows icing potential light, moderate, and severe. And this is for a flight from Cambridge to Cologne at flight level 80 on a particular day. And you can glance at this and take a view that that particular flight is unlikely to be affected by ice, but you would certainly need to cross-check it with a vertical cut, with a synoptic, with some TAFs, METARs, and SIGMETs, and so on. I think these sort of forecasts are useful for guidance. Should you wish not to spend the money to buy icing forecasts, I find a very good proxy is a relative humidity chart. So this is a relative humidity chart, same flight, same day, slightly different level. And you can see this line here showing 90% relative humidity roughly corresponds to the same shape of the forecast ice. And I've personally found that looking at a relative humidity chart is some ways a good proxy for looking at if ice is likely or not for a particular flight. So further resources, I'll distribute this online. Number one, if you've not done it, the Glenn Research Centre online course on icing is absolutely brilliant, and it's free. AOPA's Air Safety Institute has got dozens of videos about ice. I particularly like the one called Ambushed by Ice. I recommend it to you, about a 182 encountering severe ice. Air Safety Foundation has an advisory on ice, and the FAA advisory circular is in many ways the definitive document for the FAA's language and forecasting and certification for flight in icing conditions. So to wrap up, what you need to know. Given all the variables of forecasting that I've been describing, I think with ice, if there's a number one idea, you always have to have an escape route. And it's not something where you can trust the forecast. The location, intensity, timing of ice, according to NASA, is difficult to predict. NASA go on to say, by the way, that if you fly in icing conditions, you cannot rely solely on forecasts to avoid serious icing encounters, because you cannot always avoid icing, you must understand how it can affect your aircraft. And as pilots, we have to live with this. Conditions where it's credible that ice might form, however, can be predicted in advance. And freezing level forecasts are usually quite accurate, even a few days ahead. TAF and METARs don't really help us, nor do SIGMETs really, other than to tell us there's severe ice, which in most aircraft I've ever flown means you don't fly. And we have no actuals. This is the real tragedy with icing in Europe. We have no PIREPs, no actuals. So for flying, cumuliform cloud, large vertical, small horizontal range, quite high intensity ice, especially the tops, therefore avoid laterally. Stratiform, large horizontal range, small vertical range, lower intensity ice. That's where you can start avoiding it horizontally. And the number of times I've seen published on pilot forums and so on, this idea you just need to climb 1,000 or 2,000 or descend 1,000 or 2,000 feet. Great idea if you're in stratiform cloud. And the duration is that icing can persist for very long periods, i.e. greater than fuel endurance, although clouds do age and eventually glaciate. So there's my briefing. Icing, what you need to know, the limitations of forecast, and what you need to know before flying in it. It's time for me to move into listening mode. I'd love to take some questions.
Alan, could I ask a question?
Go, yeah, please do.
Picking up on something that Aidan mentioned earlier about the descent of a cold-soaked airframe into water at a, visible moisture at a lower level. To my experiences, that doesn't actually require supercooled droplets. It can happen with, water that's above freezing, because particularly if the fuel tanks have been cold soaked for a very long periods of time, for a longer high altitude flight, particularly something like a PA-46 or something like that. Would you accept that supercooled liquid droplets aren't a factor there, but it can still be? I think Aidan mentioned it, going down cold soaked airframe, being forced to hold in quite a lot of visible moisture, that can capture your attention under certain circumstances.
It can, although its duration is usually reasonably short, because the counter effect to it is that the water at 1 degree C or whatever is acting as a water warmer of your airframe. So you're quite correct that yes, it can happen, but the counter effect is that the water is a great way of cooling things down and warming things up, because there's a lot of energy in it. So it can be a temporary problem, but is unlikely to persist. But I'd be very interested to hear other views.
Can I slightly challenge that? Because certainly, again, using my experience in the PA-46, because it's a wet wing system and the fuel is right up against the wing structure, it then becomes a matter of heat transference, doesn't it? Really, it's a physics problem that the fuel is sitting in there at minus 40 degrees, and it will take a time for that fuel will keep on cooling down that wing surface longer than one might anticipate.
You're correct, and there's a lot more. You're quite correct, Paul, to say there's a lot more heat capacity in 50 gallons of fuel than there is in 1 millimeter of aluminium sheet. So no, it's a good comment.
I have a question, Alan, if I may.
Please.
I was wondering, in the GRAMET, can you see the difference between moderate and severe ice? Does it show?
That is a wonderful question, and I would like this panel perhaps to help me. In all the years of looking at GRAMET, I have never seen it depict severe ice.
No.
If you go onto the GRAMET website, the Autorouter GRAMET website, it says that severe ice is shown with a different depiction.
Yeah.
I've yet to see it on an Autorouter GRAMET.
I think it's also worth, sorry, I was going to say it's also worth saying that severe ice is quite, or the reality of severe ice as opposed to people forecasting it is pretty unusual. I've encountered it twice in, what, 5,000 hours of IFR. And it's absolutely horrible. It's a revolting experience, and you don't think you're going to survive it, but it is relatively unusual.
I think I possibly have a related question for possibly Timothy or Alan. The other interesting one, which I remember from my IRR revision before the exams, is encounters with freezing rain. Is this something that actually happens a lot, or is that something that's actually quite rare?
Shall I answer first, Timothy? Perhaps you. So there are parts of the world where freezing rain is quite a common phenomenon. So the northeast of the United States. And one way of getting freezing rain is if you've got the nose of a warm front with a sub-zero layer underneath it. The rain falls from the warm front through the sub-zero layer and becomes super cooled. And freezing rain is by definition severe ice. And there is a whole...
I was actually going to say, Alan, as a more glib answer, the place you most often hear about it is in accident reports.
And not only most glib, but also a much better answer. So yeah, freezing rain, there's a whole class of icing called SLD, supercooled large droplet, which includes freezing drizzle, freezing rain, and as Timothy says, you hear about it in accident reports, and the machinery in those reports can be airliners.
Right.
Yeah, freezing rain is relatively rare, but really quite deadly. I mean, I've been over the Alps in a Banderanti, which cleared for known icing, where the aircraft could not maintain altitude, lost 2,000 feet in a turn going back to northern Italy, and we only survived because it didn't hit the highest bits of the Alps. You know, it is not something to take on if you've got any warning of it, and certainly if you start to experience it, you are approaching the fulmination of your insurance policies. So the best thing is to turn around and get away.
Absolutely, and the other thing maybe worth discussing is freezing fog, which is something you can get near the ground, but you can get rapid accretion of ice in the takeoff run in freezing fog.
Any more questions?
Alan, can I just ask you something that happened in the first part of your presentation? You talked about not going over the North Sea when you're already 2 to 3 miles above it. What was the relevance of that?
Oh, I guess it's I said right at the beginning that we make our personal choices, and I think sort of deliberately heading further out across the North Sea in January, if I don't have to, I'd just rather not do it, and even though I fly a twin.
Okay.
For those of you on this call that don't know Trevor, he flew his aircraft exactly the same as mine, a twin Comanche, across the Pacific. So he probably has a slightly different appetite for sea crossings than I do.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just that you have no terrain considerations over the sea. It's generally warmer the lower you go, so you can go very low over the sea. I mean, I regard the North Sea as not exactly a safe place, but not really bringing any extra hazard to it over and above what we saw in the Gramat you presented, which is clearly well worth serious thinking.
Yeah.
Just my 5 pence.
It's Aiden here again. Very briefly, I know we're edging on time. Can I ask you how you would interpret your initial Gramat if you had a non-de-iced plane?
Yeah, I think that going into icing conditions, are you familiar with the Tododar mnemonic? I think that if you have ice protection on an aircraft, it makes the time considerably longer. I think if you have no ice protection, then that time would be extremely short indeed.
I was just going to expand on that. I think there's a feeling among people, particularly those who don't have de-icing equipment, that it's like a sort of a binary, oh, don't worry, I've got de-icing equipment, that'll keep me out of trouble. De-icing equipment, particularly in light aircraft, is pretty weak. It only covers the front 2 or 3 inches of each of the surfaces, and very often you're left with ice on those boots. It's pretty good on propellers, but again, even on propellers, it only covers the first half or thereabouts of the propeller blade. You really don't want to fly on ice, even if you've got de-icing equipment. Think of it more as being your dinghy than your boat, shall we say.
Got it.
And follow up on that. Sorry, very quickly. Several references to cold-soaked aircraft. Flying at levels very cold where you're not going to pick up ice, but your escape route or your transition down to where you intend to land is through icing conditions. So my question is related to Timothy's comments there. Has anyone ever experienced circumstances where the de-icing equipment is not able to keep up with the ice accretion?
I certainly have. I don't know if anyone else wants to take it.
Go ahead, Timothy.
Okay. Well, I've been in a position I can't actually remember whether it was a Cessna 404 or a Chieftain, because I was flying both at the same time. I was doing Christmas mail flights, so it was right in the middle of winter. And I mean, this was one of the 2 occasions when I've encountered severe icing. And very rapidly, I got to the point where I had full power and was at blue line, which means, you can't really go any slower than that, and descending at about 400 or 500 feet a minute. I was on a full mayday. I managed to get down into, I think, East Midlands, and actually the ice did start coming off at about 1,500 feet, but it was one of the shittiest moments of my flying career. So yes, it happens.
And those 2 examples were the previous 2 examples of severe icing. So it's in those rare but dangerous severe icing conditions. But for moderate icing, generally the GA weak de-icing equipment is fit for purpose.
I would say yes, but not something you want to be relying on. But I don't want to be the only one. I mean, everyone else other people must have had experience of this. Perhaps other people can say.
I will share one personal view of de-icing equipment, that we spend a lot of time worrying about the reliability of our engines. In my experience, de-icing equipment is less reliable than an engine, just in terms of, does it work when you test it before flight? So I think Timothy's suggestion that this is your dinghy, not your boat, I think is a very good one. If everybody is willing, I would like to move on to the final part of the seminar. And this is a very different format. You'll note in the chat window that I've posted a document. What I'd like you all to do is download the document, and do so now, and open the document. The reason being, I'm going to split you all into breakout rooms for 10 minutes, and you won't be able to access the document once you're in the breakout rooms. And I'm sure you're all good friends. I'm going to split you into breakout rooms randomly. You can work entirely on your own on the scenario, or you can work amongst your group. But just while you're downloading and opening the documents, I'll give you about 10 minutes. But to set the scene, it's Saturday night. You've been at Aero Expo in Friedrichshafen all week. Not a care in the world, but you absolutely must get home sometime Sunday because of work on Monday morning. You've really got to make a decision that Saturday night as to whether to try flying yourself home or see about getting a scheduled ticket. So, is everyone downloaded okay?
No, Trevor hasn't got anything.
No, I haven't got anything in the chat area either.
Is anyone looking at this on an iPad rather than a computer?
iPad,
Yes.
Yes, it may not work on an iPad.
Oh dear.
But you can join. I'm going to split you into breakout rooms.
If you give me 30 seconds, Alan, I'll post it somewhere with a URL that people can download.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Just for information, Alan, I'm on a Mac laptop, but I don't appear to see it either.
Okay.
I can see a document there, but when I press download, it just asks me to save it on what I can see is not my computer.
How odd.
It is your computer. Just browse up and up and up. It's probably about 10 layers deep inside Chrome or something. Just keep going up until you get to the desktop or something like that.
Okay, we'll try that.
Here's actually a much better idea. Thank you, Neil. Please.
Yeah, got that.
Got the link?
Got the document now. Thanks, Neil.
Yep.
I'll also, for anyone who misses it on the Zoom chat, I'll pop it on the forum as well so people can get it from there.
Brilliant, Neil. Thank you very much. I will now create the breakout rooms. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Hello, everybody in the plenary, I suppose is the best way to describe it. I've just posted something on chat for you.
Clear above that.
Yeah, I think I'd be looking at what time the trains are.
Yeah, well, I mean, the alternative is you can wait because the TAF
Yeah.
is trending better as the time
Yeah.
as the day goes on, and the synoptics indicating the same thing. So
Yeah.
there's a tendency to say
cast from a briefer at Luxembourg, and he told me 3 to 5 octaves tops 8,000 feet. So I should have been in the blue all the way. So I'm sure we've all had situations or experiences like that, which makes us all ultra. You know, it's better to be ultra cautious about ice than.
So would you do that in a twin com, Timothy?
In a de-ice twin com, the answer is I would. They're not particularly slippery. They're not bad in ice. I probably would. I don't think I'd do it in, for example, a Cirrus. Well, I suppose it goes pull the parachute.
Chris, what's your thoughts?
I don't think I would do it because there's no escape possibility. It's easy to think, okay, we can manage, we can do it because we have a Fiki, but still there's no escape.
Yeah.
But you're looking at the Grammet for the morning, but the synoptic for the afternoon looks okay, doesn't it?
Well, the synoptic from the afternoon hasn't really changed significantly. If you overlaid the morning and the afternoon, well, they're actually midnight and mid.
I'd say, if you don't mind me interrupting your train of thought, how's everybody in the plenary? welcome back, everybody. Please go ahead and give me your answers. If I can, we are at 70% take up at the moment. If I can urge this, I promise this is entirely anonymous. If I can ask the remaining dozen of you or so to make a judgment call, and then I'll share the results and we'll go into a debrief. Okay, we're at 85%. So in the interest of time, 87%. In the interest of time, I'm going to end the poll and I'll share the results. There you go. Who would like to kick off the debrief? And the question on the briefing document was, what's the critical issue relating to this flight? Who would like to pick up? Who would like to pick this up?
Sure, I can do. Why not? So possibly for me, flying a non-protected aircraft, the main one that I think our group found was that the 0-degree isotherm was below the ground, which is never a good thing. So that kind of removed a lot of our outs and the way we were going to be able to like actually complete the flight. So I think our kind of, well, my view is that we wouldn't try and fly that route. We might try and go further west or further east, but possibly because it's non-FICI, trying to fly somewhere where the where 0-degree isotherm is below the MSA is kind of a hard stop for me anyway.
Good answer. Who else would like to pick up, either share something different or pick up on Neil's points?
Alan, we basically thought similarly. Couple of things, two different things. What we might have done would be to run the OGMET. I know you had to make a decision, but it would be worth running the OGMET for later in the day, say for a 12 o'clock departure and a 4 o'clock departure, just to see if there was any material difference. That's a relatively quick and easy thing to do.
Yep.
And the other point was that when I was flying the jet prop, which was the most bonkers airplane that could climb at 3,000 feet a minute fairly comfortably, and probably nearly 4 if you were light and really stood it on its tail, it does kind of would influence the climb performance of the airplane, would influence my decision as well. Because the icing layer was about 5,000 feet thick as predicted. If you can be through it in 1 minute and 15 seconds, then that would give a different perspective than flying in a non-turbocharged aeroplane.
Yep. Some other comments.
We had a bit of
sorry, go ahead.
We had a bit of a discussion about perhaps departing VFR, possibly looking for an alternative route to clear the terrain and then climbing into the clearer, climbing to flight level 100 in the clearer space.
I think you've accidentally muted yourself, Michael. Who's next?
I think we took the view that delaying probably wasn't an option, because looking at the two synoptics, or the two forecasts, they were pretty similar. Not much is moving. The fronts are pretty much in the same place, so weather was unlikely to change. We noticed a slight shift in wind later on in the day, but it didn't look like things were going to change very differently. So I felt that delaying was probably not an option. Quick look at Sky Demon, Freirutschaffen is pretty hemmed in by that sort of terrain all the way around it. You're not going to get out in it's not going to look significantly different whichever direction you try and fly in.
Yep.
And the option, if you really, really need to get away, would be on the day. You'd have to take the chance that you might just be able to see a peek away through the mountains and see some blue sky or something, which wouldn't be likely, and see a way through clear to the point where you could at least get a climb out from under where the icing is predicted. But that would be an extremely high risk strategy, both in terms of its viability and, if you attempted it, its survivability.
Yep. Any more comments?
Well, as part of Michael's team with Lars on the VFR out route, I think one of the things that gave us comfort was we could catch the train to Munich and get a sort of a midday or late afternoon flight back.
Yep.
So we could wait until tomorrow, till the Sunday, to make the decision, and the decision would be, can we see well enough to go? And if we can't, get the train.
Good answer. I like the I like the certainty of the decision-making process. Anybody else want to make a comment? I noticed that 97% said they wouldn't go in the TB20. Why is that?
I didn't even see a TB20 mentioned in the brief. Was it in there?
No, it was in the chat window. So I hit all the groups with this after the first 10 minutes and put it in the chat window.
I didn't get that.
Ah.
I saw you the message about looking at in the chat window, and I didn't. I couldn't see anything.
Nothing came up there.
Can you see it in the chat window now?
No.
No, it's still not.
Okay, that's really odd. I have it in my chat window, and
there's your answer. We all said no because the question wasn't asked.
The last thing in the chat window that I can see anyway is Neil's Halon link.
Yes.
I can see it in the chat window.
Yeah. Okay. Well, not to worry. I did send out. I'll resend it just out of your interest. Is this one here? You found out. You waited to the next morning. The weather forecast is unchanged, and you decided to go, but your aircraft was broken. Somebody comes along and says, "I've got a TB20 with a hot prop, and I'm going. Are you going to jump in?"
And 3% of us said yes. I'd be interested to hear from them.
So forgive me if there's been a tech glitch on sending this particular material out. Shall I do a debrief and a wrap up?
Just to say, 3% is presumably just one person then, right?
Correct. And I said this poll was anonymous, so we're not going to look for...
No, come on, fess up.
But before we stop, can I ask you for next week's lottery numbers, please?
I think just the one of the slightly serious and less serious one we had is I think it was mentioned in our group that the a northerly route looks like the MSA is quite a bit lower, so that might be possible to do something around that and then direct Cambridge before climbing later on, but it generally looked like a really high risk flight. And also everyone thinks that flying with Ryanair is terrible no matter what time it is.
Yes. Okay, let me do a debrief on this. This is great. I hope you enjoyed the scenario, by the way.
Excellent. It was just the right difficulty, because nothing was obvious, and I thought it was a really excellently chosen example.
Thank you. And by the way, it is a real weather scenario. I'm not making up grammets using Photoshop. Right, let's share my screen. Oh, by the way, I can never resist this photo. This is a trig point that illustrates the point that ice doesn't stop. Trig point up in Scotland. And I think that if you encounter severe ice, you are likely to fly like a trig point. Right. Here's my debrief, and I think quite a useful model is that there is a layer that is between the minimum safety altitude and the ground. And I tend to use the phrase personally, it's just something I've coined myself, to say if the 0 degree isotherm is in that area, even if it's not on the ground, that's what I call terrain ice. That there is no way of descending into warmer air and losing ice without descending below the MSA. And figuring out a way of shedding ice by finding warm air in the Friedrichshafen area when the freezing level is about 2,000 feet, I guess could be done if you wanted to skim the lake at 500 feet and go up and down. It doesn't feel to me like a very sensible strategy for executing a flight. The other thing, and this picks up on Paul Sherry's comments about climb performance, both the aircraft in the scenario were non-turbocharged. What we have here is actually a runaway effect. So as we climb, power goes down anyway. As we climb and pick up some ice as well, our climb rate goes down. And as you get into the tops of the clouds, the amount of ice you're picking up is going up, not down. So this really is quite a nasty runaway effect for a non-turbocharged aircraft, where the temptation to just another couple of thousand feet is actually when you're starting to potentially lose quite a large chunk of your climb performance. We didn't discuss escapes in particular, but there's all manner of reasons why you might need an escape from this. That's the O in Tododar. And whenever you've got terrain ice, that means straight away your options are limited. And for needing an escape, you might pick up more ice than you expected. There might be more ice than you can handle. You know how unreliable the forecast is. I would not risk finding clear air at flight level 100. It might be there, but it might not. It might be flight level 120, and you might find yourself in a position with a normally aspirated aircraft covered in ice, struggling to get to flight level 120, where your option is to return and do an instrument approach in icing conditions in Friedrichshafen. And I've already mentioned equipment failure. De-icing equipment is reliable enough, but it does sometimes break. I also think there's a question of airmanship. And maybe this is something personal to me. I think there would be a difference in tackling this flight saying, the boot has failed on my Navajo and I'm getting ice asymmetrically. I'd like an emergency descent back into Friedrichshafen, please. From an airmanship perspective, is slightly different to, I tried it, I chanced it in my Robin, I'm covered in ice and I can't maintain altitude. That, from an airmanship perspective, there is a difference between those two things. If you were to go in the TwinCom, the de-ice TwinCom, going back to something I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to skip a point here, you would definitely want a straight climb. You'd want a clearance to 100 or 120, whatever you were flying, I would propose. And you wouldn't want to be messed around by being held at 60, then 70 and 80, whatever it might be. And I think one thing in favor of going for this in a de-ice TwinCom is that this isn't the London TMA on a Friday night where you can't get a word in edgeways. There's a reasonable chance you'll be able to get what you want out of it. In terms of the TB20, and I'm sorry you didn't all get the chat about the TB20. Going back to Dodar, the main difference is the time domain. If you've got a de-iced aeroplane, you have some time to make some decisions. If you were to climb and start picking up really quite a lot of ice in this circumstance in a non-de-iced aircraft, you've got to do something about it straight away. The tea becomes almost immediate. Anyway, thank you for your tolerance of this scenario. I hope you, I certainly hope you enjoyed it. And I say sorry for the slight tech glitch. I would like to wrap up the seminar. We are at 1 hour, 40 minutes, 10 minutes longer than I expected. I hope you all enjoyed it. I will stay on the meeting for the next 10 or 20 minutes if anybody's got any comments they want to add. I have a final poll I need to share with you all, which is this. Would you be interested in coming back for more? And how did you find the 1800 Zulu start time? So please give me your answers in due course. I would like to do a debrief myself on the session. For me, it's an agonizing choice about what I put in and what I don't put in to one of these seminars. And I think I was right to leave out severe ice, but I was glad it came up. Personal critique, I should definitely have done something regarding cold soaked airframes, and 2 of you raised it, and I hadn't chosen to include it. So thank you for raising it. That needs to go in the next one. And my general sense is that this might have been a slightly better session if the first piece had run, say, 10 minutes shorter. But I tend to be very self-critical about these sort of things. So from the formal part of the seminar, I've enjoyed delivering it, and it's been brilliant to see best part of 50 people, including many people I've not met before. Some of you are familiar faces, but it's been absolutely brilliant to see some names come along and join in and be part of our community during this seminar. So from a formal part of the seminar, I'm going to draw a close. I'm glad you all stayed, and I'm very happy to take any informal questions or comments for the next 10 minutes or so. Thanks very much. And I'm going to stop recording now, and thanks again for the remaining